Money can't buy happiness. That's what they tell you. But try explaining that to someone drowning in student debt, watching housing prices climb 40% while their wages stay frozen. The truth is, every generation has a number, a threshold. The amount they believe will finally deliver financial security, peace of mind, and yes, maybe even happiness. Today, we read dissecting one of the most revealing economic patterns of our time. The staggering divergence in what each generation considers financially successful. Spoiler alert. The gap between what baby boomers needed and what Gen Z thinks they need isn't just wide. It's a chasm that tells us everything about inflation, wage stagnation, asset bubbles, and the slow death of the American dream. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your grandparents could buy a house on a factory wage, why your parents are terrified of retirement, and why your younger siblings think $500,000 a year is just getting by. Let's talk economics. Before we dive into the data, we need to establish our baseline. The generations that set the template for American prosperity. The greatest generation, born 1901 to 1927, and the silent generation, born 1928 to 1945. These weren't just any cohorts. These were the people who experienced the Great Depression firsthand. We're talking 25% unemployment at its peak. Soup kitchens. Dust Bowl migration. Entire families losing everything. This wasn't theoretical economics, this was survival. The psychological impact of the Depression cannot be overstated. It created what economists call a scarcity mentality that persisted across decades. Even after World War II ended and American manufacturing exploded into the greatest economic boom in human history, these generations couldn't shake the trauma. Here's what's fascinating from an economic perspective. Post-war America had everything going for it. The rest of the industrialized world was in ruins. The U.S. had untouched infrastructure, a massive manufacturing base converted from wartime production, and the GI Bill pumping money into education and housing. The result? A buyer's market in almost everything. Housing construction boomed. The federal government subsidized mortgages through the FHA and VA loans. Interest rates were manageable. A factory worker could legitimately afford a home, a car, and support a family on a single income. The marginal propensity to consume shot up, but so did savings rates because these generations never forgot what scarcity felt like. This is the context that shaped the baby boomers. They grew up watching their parents act like the next depression was always one bad harvest away, even as prosperity surrounded them. That frugality, that caution, that became the cultural inheritance. And this is why when we look at the data on what it takes to be financially successful, we need to understand these generations were playing a completely different economic game. Born between 1946 and 1964, baby boomers are the generation that hit the economic jackpot. And the data backs this up in ways that should make every economist's jaw drop. When surveyed about what annual income they'd need to feel financially successful, baby boomers gave the lowest number of any generation, $100,000. Now, before you think that's still a lot, let's put this in context. Adjusted for inflation from their prime earning years, we're talking about what would have been $30,000 to $40,000 in 1980s dollars. That was achievable. That was realistic, and critically, that was enough. Why? Let's break down the economic fundamentals. First, housing. The median home price in 1970 was $23,400. The median household income was $9,870. That's a price-to-income ratio of 2.37. Today, the median home price is around $420,000, with a median household income of $75,000. That's a ratio of 5.6. Housing has more than doubled in relative cost. Second, education. In 1980, the average cost of tuition at a four-year public university was $2,550. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $9,400 today. The actual cost today? Over $28,000. Real costs have tripled. Third, the job market. Boomers entered a labor market with a structural advantage. Manufacturing jobs were abundant and paid well. You could walk onto a factory floor with a high school diploma and earn a middle-class wage. Union membership was at 35% in the 1950s, which meant negotiating power for workers. Pensions were standard. The social contract between employers and employees was intact. Fourth, and this is crucial, wage growth matched productivity growth. From 1948 to 1973, productivity increased 96.7%, and hourly compensation grew 91.3%. They moved together. Workers captured the gains from economic growth. Then something broke. From 1979 to 2020, productivity increased 61.8%, but hourly compensation only grew 17.5%. The link was severed. This is the moment when the economic ladder started to be pulled up, and boomers were already on the upper rungs. So when boomers say they need $100,000 to be successful, they're not being naive. They're reflecting an economic reality where that number was sufficient to afford a home, a car, healthcare, retirement savings, and the occasional vacation. The formula worked. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That formula was built on a specific set of economic conditions that no longer exist. And the generations that came after had to recalculate. Generation X, born 1965 to 1980, are the bridge generation. And their number tells a story of dawning awareness. $212,300 annually for financial success. More than double what boomers said. This isn't entitlement. This is economic reality hitting like a freight train. Gen X entered the workforce during a period of massive structural change. First, the shift from pensions to 401(k)s. This was a massive transfer of risk from employers to employees. With a traditional pension, your employer guaranteed you a set income in retirement. With a 401(k), you're gambling on the stock market. And sure, the market trends upward over time, but tell that to someone who planned to retire in 2008. The 401(k) system, introduced in 1978 but popularized in the 1980s, fundamentally changed retirement economics. It converted retirement security from a guaranteed benefit into an investment portfolio subject to market volatility. This added a layer of anxiety that previous generations never faced. Second, the recessions. Gen X experienced two significant economic contractions: the early 1990s recession and the dot-com crash in 2001. While neither reached depression-level severity, they revealed something troubling. The economic stability boomers enjoyed was not guaranteed. Third, and this is where it gets interesting from a microeconomics perspective, Gen X became the sandwich generation. They were simultaneously supporting aging parents living longer due to medical advances, and financially helping their own children who can't afford to launch. Let's talk about the economics of longevity. In 1960, life expectancy was 69.7 years. By 2000, it was 76.8 years. That's 7 additional years of retirement to fund. 7 years of potential healthcare costs. 7 years where you might need assisted living, which can run $50,000 to $100,000 annually. Meanwhile, housing costs continued to outpace wages. The price-to-income ratio kept climbing. By the time Gen X was ready to buy homes in the 1990s and 2000s, they were paying significantly more relative to their incomes than their parents did. And then there's the wage stagnation. Real wages for middle-class workers barely moved. When adjusted for inflation, a worker in 2000 earned roughly the same as a worker in 1973, despite massive productivity gains. Where did that value go? To capital, not labor. Shareholder returns, executive compensation, and corporate profits captured the gains while worker compensation flatlined. So when Gen X says they need $212,300, they're doing the math. They're looking at higher housing costs, more expensive healthcare, longer retirements to fund, children who need more financial support, parents who might need care, no pension guarantee, and market-dependent retirement savings. This isn't lifestyle inflation. This is a rational response to a deteriorating economic situation. But at least Gen X had time to adjust their expectations. The next generation didn't even get that luxury. Here's where the narrative gets interesting. Millennials, born 1981 to 1996, actually have lower expectations than Gen X, $181,000 annually for financial success. Wait, what? How does that make sense? Everything got more expensive. Housing, education, healthcare, all of it. So why did the number go down? The answer is as tragic as it is economically revealing. Millennials have given up on the traditional markers of success. Let us start with the economic meteor strike that defined this generation, the Great Recession of 2008. This wasn't just a recession. This was the worst economic crisis since the Depression, and millennials took it right in the teeth. Between 2007 and 2009, 8.7 million jobs vanished. The unemployment rate hit 10%. But here's what really matters. Youth unemployment hit 19.5%. If you were entering the job market during this period, you were devastated. And economic research shows that entering the workforce during a recession creates a scarring effect that impacts earnings for 10 to 15 years afterward. Studies by economists like Till von Wachter have quantified this. College graduates who enter the workforce during a recession earn 10 to 15% less in their first year. And it takes a decade to catch up. That's a decade of lost earning potential, lost retirement savings, lost home equity accumulation. But here's the uncomfortable economic truth. This attitude is self-fulfilling. If an entire generation doesn't invest in education, careers, homeownership, or retirement because they think it's pointless, they guarantee their own economic failure. Let's ground this in actual numbers because every generation is operating in fantasyland to some degree. The median household income in the United States is approximately $75,000. That means half of all households earn less than that. Every single generation, from boomers onward, set their financial success threshold above $100,000. The dream, even the scaled-down version, is out of reach for more than half the country. This creates a massive psychological gap. Most people are earning significantly less than what they believe they need to be successful. That's a recipe for perpetual dissatisfaction. But here's what's even more revealing. The numbers don't correlate with happiness data. Research consistently shows that happiness increases with income up to about $75,000 to $90,000 annually, then plateaus. Beyond that point, more money doesn't meaningfully increase well-being. So why are we chasing numbers so much higher than the happiness threshold? Because we're not actually chasing happiness. We're chasing security. Every generation is responding to economic instability by inflating their safety number. Boomers needed less because they had structural supports: pensions, unions, affordable housing, stable employment. Each subsequent generation has fewer supports, so they compensate by raising the number. Gen Z's insane $587,800 figure isn't about happiness. It's about building a fortress. It's about having enough money that you never have to depend on an employer, a government program, or a financial system that might collapse. This is the economics of anxiety. And here's the tragic part. While everyone is chasing these inflated numbers, the actual economic conditions keep deteriorating. Real wages aren't keeping pace with productivity. Housing costs keep climbing. Healthcare costs keep climbing. Education costs keep climbing. Meanwhile, the safety nets are fraying. Union membership is at historic lows. Pension plans are disappearing. Social Security's trust fund might be depleted by 2034. We're in a doom loop. Economic instability drives up the security threshold, which makes that threshold harder to reach, which increases economic anxiety, which drives up the threshold further, and the policy response has been minimal. We're not addressing wage stagnation. We're not addressing housing costs. We're not addressing healthcare costs. We're not addressing the structural issues that make financial security increasingly unattainable. Instead, we get told to budget better, skip the avocado toast, and maybe pick up a side hustle. Individual solutions to systemic problems. So what's the answer? How much money does each generation actually need to be happy? The honest answer is, it depends on what you mean by happy. If you mean the absence of financial stress, the number is probably closer to that $75,000 to $90,000 range, where research shows happiness plateaus. That's enough to cover basics, have some discretionary spending, and not worry about bills. But if you mean the feeling of success, of having made it, of achieving the American dream, well, that number keeps climbing because the dream keeps moving further away. The real problem isn't that each generation wants different amounts. The problem is that the economic system is failing to deliver security at any level. Baby boomers got lucky with timing. Gen X is scrambling to keep up. Millennials have lowered their expectations. Gen Z has given up on expectations entirely. This isn't sustainable. When an entire generation thinks they need $500,000 a year just to feel secure, something is fundamentally broken. We need structural fixes. We need wage growth to match productivity. We need affordable housing. We need accessible healthcare. We need to rebuild the social safety net. We need to restore some version of the social contract that made middle-class security possible. Otherwise, we're just going to keep seeing these numbers climb. Gen Alpha will probably say they need $1 million a year. Gen Beta will say $2 million. At some point, the whole thing collapses. The price of happiness keeps going up, not because we're getting greedier, but because we're getting more afraid. And fear is expensive. If you want to dive deeper into the economics of generational wealth, check out my video on wage stagnation and productivity. And if you found this valuable, subscribe for more economic analysis that actually explains what's happening to your paycheck. Thanks for watching. Now go check your 401k and try not to panic. Then there's the student debt crisis. The average student loan debt for millennials is $33,000, but many carry far more. And unlike previous generations, millennials had to take on this debt because college became mandatory for entry-level jobs that didn't require degrees 30 years ago. Here's the brutal economic logic. Previous generations could get middle-class jobs without degrees. Millennials needed degrees to get those same jobs but had to go into debt to get them. The barrier to entry increased without a corresponding increase in wages. That's a market failure. Housing? Forget about it. By the time millennials were ready to buy, we were in the middle of a housing bubble. Then a crash, then a recovery that sent prices soaring past pre-crash levels. The homeownership rate for adults under 35 dropped from 43.6% in 2004 to 37.3% in 2016. An entire generation was priced out. The gig economy emerged during this period, which sounds innovative until you realize it's just a nice way of saying employment without benefits, job security, or wage growth. Uber drivers and DoorDash couriers aren't entrepreneurs. They're workers who've been classified as contractors to avoid labor protections. So why did millennials' number drop to $181,000? Because they're not chasing the same dream. Homeownership isn't a universal goal anymore. Having kids got delayed or abandoned entirely. The traditional life trajectory of house, marriage, kids, retirement got scrambled. When millennials say they need $181,000, they're not imagining a house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and 3 kids. They're imagining paying off student loans, renting a decent apartment, maybe taking a vacation and having some retirement savings. That's it. The dream shrank. This is what economists call preference falsification, but it's really just adapting to constraints. You can't want what's impossible, so you recalibrate your expectations downward and call it choice. But here's the thing, even this reduced number is out of reach for most millennials. The median household income is $75,000. Even the compromised dream is unattainable. And then Gen Z entered the chat. $587,800 per year. That's what Gen Z, born 1997 to 2012, says they need to be financially successful. That number is bananas. It's nearly 6 times what boomers said. It's almost 3 times what Gen X said. It dwarfs the actual US median household income. What is going on? Let's start with what we know. Gen Z is the most financially pessimistic generation in modern history. They came of age during or after the Great Recession. They watched millennials struggle, and then COVID hit and destroyed whatever stability remained. From an economic standpoint, Gen Z faces a perfect storm. First, they have the highest student loan debt of any generation. The average is now over $37,000 and climbing. The ROI on college education continues to deteriorate as costs rise faster than graduate wages. Second, housing is completely unaffordable. The median home price has increased 47% since 2019. 47%. In 4 years. Meanwhile, real wages increased maybe 2 to 3%. The math doesn't math. Third, they're entering a labor market that's increasingly winner-take-all. High-paying tech jobs pay really well. Everything else? Stagnant. The middle is hollowing out. You're either in the top 20% or you're struggling. Fourth, inflation hit hard. After decades of stable prices, inflation spiked to 9.1% in 2022. For a generation that never experienced sustained inflation, this was shocking. Groceries cost more. Gas cost more. Everything cost more all at once. Fifth, and this is the psychological element, Gen Z has no faith in institutions. They don't trust that Social Security will exist when they retire. They don't trust that pensions or 401ks will be sufficient. They don't trust the housing market, the job market, or the government to maintain stability. So what's really happening with that $587,800 number? I think it's one of 3 things. Option 1. Total disconnection from economic reality. Gen Z grew up in a digital world where they see luxury lifestyles constantly. Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, all showing wealth and excess. Maybe their baseline for success got warped by social media exposure. Option 2. They're including everything. Not just annual income, but total assets needed to feel secure. Maybe they're thinking, I need enough to pay off debt, buy a house, fund retirement, and have a cushion. And when you add all that up, you get a huge number. Option 3. They're not describing what they need for comfort. They're describing what they need to escape. The number is so high because they recalculating what it would take to opt out of the broken system entirely. I think it's actually option 3, and here's why. Gen Z has given up on the latter. They don't believe in incremental progress. They think the system is fundamentally broken and rigged. So when they say $587,800, they're not describing a realistic goal. They're describing what it would take to win the game completely and never have to worry again. This is economically revealing. It shows that Gen Z doesn't believe in wage growth, career progression, or the accumulation of assets over time. They think you either get lucky, strike it rich somehow, or you struggle forever. And honestly, given what they've witnessed, can you blame them? They watched their parents get crushed in 2008. They watched millennials drown in debt. They saw housing become unaffordable. They experienced a pandemic that shut down the world. They're watching AI threaten to automate millions of jobs. They're watching climate change accelerate with no serious response. From their perspective, asking for $587,800 isn't greed. It's the bare minimum needed to insulate yourself from a world that's increasingly chaotic and hostile.